that Elisha ben Abuya thinks that Akiva is being too theoretical, too airy-fairy, too dissociated from actual human life.
It's not from,
It's
not simply from his field of expertise.
Well, the question is, what does it mean to be expert? I mean, Akiva was known as a great Aggadist. He was instrumental, more than any other rabbis of the Tannaitic period, in creating the rules for interpretation, in promulgating interpretations that became standard in Jewish thought, rabbinic thought, and so forth. He was probably the most important of the rabbis of the Tannaitic period, first and second centuries.
I see.
Common era.
I understand what you're saying then. So what you're really saying is what is it that we know?
Yes, and what to say that you know something can't just be on the level of language or of concept. Okay, especially as it regards human behavior. You know, people will say that constantly. Oh, I know that, or I already knew that. But the question is, do you act that way? Mm-hmm. Does your behavior embody what it is that you know? And if you're dealing with morality or with ethics or with proper behavior or growing as a human being, it doesn't cut it to simply understand things from a theoretical point of view.
So isn't there also the question of like we talk about this a lot in Zen, about our actual practice, you know, like washing a bowl is the practice. Dealing with the dead is an actual practice, mm-hmm. where a belief is not a practice.
A belief is not a practice. Yes, that's true, and that is the point that's being made here.
Okay.
That if we're going to deal with understanding what our relationship with God is, and in that context, trying to understand and to better and to grow in terms of our humanity, it's not enough just to understand it or to think about it. It has the thoughts have to be embodied in our behavior.
We have to practice it.
You have to practice it, and the how you practice it is there's a particular way to do that. That is to say, you can't just give lip service to the action. The action has to embody the value. Okay, so
and it also, I think, has to arise spontaneously in a particular circumstance.
What do you mean by that, Michael?
Well, I always use the analogy of someone trying to someone trying to catch a ball that was thrown to them. Uh-huh. And they read all these books and they work out all these physics equations, but when the ball comes at them, they don't have time to do all of that stuff. Right. They either catch the ball or they don't. And so when we encounter whatever circumstance happens to be, sometimes it's our own thoughts, sometimes someone else's thoughts, sometimes some words and stuff.
Yeah.
How do we behave in that instant? And that determines whether we have sort of a core understanding of it, or whether it's, as you put, a little more theoretical or intellectual.
Yeah. It's interesting that you bring up an example or a comparison from sports, because you know there are all sorts of ways in which we learn how to do things from a book, from our conversation, from instruction, and so on and so forth. None of that means that you can play tennis.
Right.
Playing tennis is about so assimilating what tennis incorporates that you do it without having to think about it.
In fact, the opposite can be true. where it can actually
Right.
you. Like
Yeah.
like I find when art critics or art historians try to make art, they're just like making fools of themselves because they have so much knowledge. And there's a wonderful story about a famous violinist who could do one thing that no one else in the world could do. And a little girl comes up to him and says, you know, how do you do that? And he looked down at his violin and he could never do it again.
Oh,
Oh, really? That's a good story.
So
Go ahead.
well, I think we all start from our own reality. And so everything that comes towards us has to be incorporated with where we are in the beginning. And I think the image of the throne with one, the head in the clouds and the feet on the footstool is we come together in the middle. And it's not all vision, etc. It's practice, walking the walk, talking the talk, or the phrase I use pretty much every morning when I walk is God is in this place and I did not know it. Is God is not only in this place, God, the whole place, but God is in this place as well.
That's
And,
very
and
important.
sometimes
Very
I
well
can
said.
get to the whole and sometimes I do this. So
The question is, I guess, you know, when we, in any action we take, thinking about it is in some ways, by definition, deficient. I mean, the idea of, as the Baal Shem Tov would have put it, that our goal, religiously or spiritually, is to become Torah. It's, if you have to think about what it is that I'm required to do, and what's the action, and what are the words that have to be said, and so on and so forth, and it's all about acting out of some definition or some description.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't assimilated it yet. We haven't become it yet. We haven't really fully made that a part of us.
You know, it's interesting you put it that way, Kerry. I remember when I was first learning how to debug problems on a computer way back in 1970. And the thing that I have always told people is what I learned was you gather facts and gather facts
Yeah,
until you become the problem.
there you go.
And then, of course, you have the answer.
I think that's a very good way of putting it, Michael. And the thing that I think is so helpful about what you just described is that when you really know something, you can do it without even necessarily having to plan it or to break it down into its component elements. You know, I had this discussion with Linda all the time. You know, she's asked to lead, to conduct, to organize a meeting, and she's done it so many times, and has done it over such a long period of time, and become so expert at it that she can just sort of do it. When she started out, she had to plan every little teeny piece of it. It's not that she doesn't plan, but she's so assimilated, so made the actual behavior a part of who she is, that she can just do it. That's what a tennis player does, or what a dancer does, or what a musician does. You don't have to think, okay, how do I play something with this technique? You have worked it and worked it and worked it so much that it becomes natural for you to do it.
I think something that we could relate to is learning to drive a car.
Okay.
In the beginning, there's this and there's that, and we have to remember to do this when we do that. And now we don't need to think about that anymore. It just happens.
Yeah, because you have so assimilated the behavior into yourself that you have become a car driver.
Yeah.
As opposed to somebody who is just trying to figure out what buttons to push and what wheels to turn and so on and so forth. When you're still at that stage, you're really not a driver yet, you know. So, I mean, you are in a certain sense, but in a much more limited sense. You're dealing with trying to improve and to grow in terms of our behavior and our identities and so on and so forth. It's not enough to know what to do. We have to be the doing. And that's where I think there is a disagreement between these two sages. I think that Elisha ben Abuya thinks that Akiva is not paying enough attention to the actual behavior. They're on two different sides of the same issue as one of the participants sees it. But as it turns out, if you look at the rest of the story, it's Elisha ben Abuya gets stuck on the level of behavior, and so winds up going off on a tangent. Whereas Akiva is able to work in both realms at the same time. He can walk and chew gum at the same time. So, which is frankly why Akiva was the greatest of these Tannaitic rabbis. He was able to operate on all these different levels at the same time without becoming stuck. That's kind of something that happens to me a lot, maybe to some of you as well, that you realize there's some changes that you need to make, but you get stuck in the process of changing.
Yeah.
And that getting stuck part is to some degree what you have to fight against if you're dealing in the world of Mussar. That's why you have another person that you study with, because they're the ones who can say to you, listen, you are stuck here. You are not making progress. You're not moving forward. You are not understanding the implications of what you yourself are saying. You're not carrying them out as you need to do. So in the context of the legend of the Pardes, the question of what role God plays in who we are and how we see ourselves and how we behave is really the overall question. And when these four rabbis go into the Pardes, they see this reflective water. And it begs the question, how do we see beyond the reflection? How do we see the real reality behind what appears to be the reality? We think that we are behaving in a certain way. We think we are living according to certain values. But if we look at ourselves in this reflecting pool, so to speak, that we're satisfied with what we're doing. But if we were to be able to look behind that and to see that this is a reflection of us and not the reality of the people we want to be, that's the breakthrough point. To be able to make a change, you have to realize that how you have come to think about yourself, what's reflected back to you, is not the whole story. There's something important behind it that we have to struggle and work to get to be connected to. So appearance and reality is is always the issue. And in the case of the Legend of the Pardes, the three who don't make it out of there unscathed are, I think, if I read the legend correctly, are unable to move past the reflection. But Akiva is different in that regard. So you think about, each of us think about our lives and things we wanted sometimes to improve about, or we wanted to change in how we relate to other people or to institutions, groups of people. It's so difficult, at least I find it so, and I think I'm speaking for many people, maybe not everybody here, but for many people, it is very, very hard to get outside of the box or the outside of the simple reflection that we encounter first. Maybe that's because we begin without thinking, well, there must be something more. That we have to push to the next level. We have to push beyond what appears to us. And if you don't start with that position of recognizing that there is something more, there's always something more. There's always some reality behind the reality. What appears to be the reality. It's hard to know how you would make progress.
So I was talking about this very thing with my wife last night.
Oh, okay.
Because I was reflecting on having been in psychotherapy for quite a number of years.
Uh-huh.
And I would have a session and I would understand something, and I would come out and it turned into the ultimate answer to all my questions.
Uh-huh. Okay.
So everything got folded into that.
And what was my
father-in-law used to say, the answer looking for questions. And so that was quite a number of years ago.
Uh-huh.
But it's an easy danger to fall into, because finding sort of a reason for something to happen, of some behavior, it's so satisfying to say, oh, that's what's going on. That's what happened. And that's why I did that. And now let me apply it to everything, was my temptation anyway.
Yeah.
And it took quite a number of years for me to say, wasn't that interesting? Now let's see what's next, or let's see what
That's
other
very
things come
interesting
up.
that you put it that way, Michael. I mean, I really just personally resonate with that very, very strongly, because part of the ongoing lesson for me in life is recognizing that whatever image I have in mind of myself or of my experience or whatever does not require me to defend it. It doesn't require me to reject criticism or to look for something more. That it's not the end all and be all. You're referring to what that is it a proverb or a saying? What about hammer and nails? If you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Right.
Yeah. Well,
right.
That's the thing. Once you get some understanding, some picture, one image of who you are and what your life is, most of us are comfortable holding on to that.
Tenaciously.
We are afraid to move beyond it. We're afraid to look at it as being at best provisional. But if we really want to grow, we have to look at whatever we think of ourselves at the moment as being provisional.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's our inclination as human beings.
Well, the number of people who study themselves in this way
Uh,
is smaller than all of the people on this planet
Certainly.
I'm sure that's true.
by a large measure.
Yes, I'm sure you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, see, that brings us to a very interesting point, because we read the story about the Pardes, and we recognize that there are hang-ups or dangers in this introspective mode,
Mhm.
and that we have to be clear about what it is we're doing and not hold on to any particular interpretation inflexibly. And yet, day to day, we have to operate without everything being up in the air. This is the in some ways the central insight of Martin Buber and the distinction between I, it, and I, thou. I, thou, of course, is the desirable mode. But you can't
Right.
live life day to day constantly in an I, thou position. I, it is not a bad thing. It's what enables us to do things.
Mhm. Right.
If you go to the post office and you want to buy a stamp, we would never get out of the post office and mail a letter if we had to have getting the stamp had to depend on having an I-thou relationship with the postal clerk.
You'd be there a while.
You'd be there a while, and maybe they wouldn't even be open to it.
Yeah.
That's Buber. His major distinction between human beings and God is that God is the eternal thou. God is always open to an I-thou relationship, but we human beings are not always open to it.
Right.
So one of the things about it that you make me think about is language,
Mm-hmm.
because I find, and people I've spoken to seem to all agree that we think in language.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing about language is that language is a distinguishing thing, so that when we give something a name, we are making a distinction between it and ourselves.
Yes.
And if we're only thinking in terms of language, then how do we ever enter this realm of I, thou?
I have, sir.
Go ahead, Kim. I'm all ears. Oh, wait a minute. That's my ear.
Well, the language that you're talking about is a mind thing,
Yes.
but real relationships are embodied,
Mm.
and so
Aren't they both? No.
aren't they both mind and body? Of course,
Yeah.
yeah, but it doesn't. Until we're actually physically present in our body and recognizing what's going on, then we're not really there.
Yeah.
It's just a concept.
And the therapists that I work with will always come back to the question, where do you feel that in your body?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of value to that question.
Mm-hmm.
It can also go too far. Wilhelm Reich and the orgone machine is a very good example. But be that as it may, there is a sense in which you cannot divorce what it is that you think and what it is that you feel from language. And adding language
Mm-hmm.
gives you a certain level, kind of understanding, but it is not the only kind of understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, when we encounter another person, it seems to me that what we're engaged in is trying to understand how we're connected, and not just in terms of what we think about that person, but how we feel about that person.
Mm.
I think you can't separate the two, but I think we do that a lot. And we have to do it in certain circumstances.
Mhm.
The post office being a good example.
Mhm.
I don't have to have any feelings that I'm aware of about the postal clerk in order to buy some stamps. At the same time, recognizing that I may have some feelings about encountering a person, even if it's somebody that I don't know well or whatever, is part of the experience. So
Yeah.
I don't think there's a way to neatly separate them.
And you can make a lot of difference in the postal clerk's life
Uh-huh.
by being physically present, as opposed to just being like an auto bomb or whatever,
Mhm.
autocom. Well, I don't know what the word is.
Automaton,
Time.
maybe?
Yeah, I mean, by smiling, by being with the person, even
Yeah.
Yeah.
for that short moment, you can make their day.
Well, haven't we been trying to do that with everybody who's been a helper of some sort or another during this pandemic?
Well, some
We're recognizing that the store clerk and the postal person and the garbage person, et cetera, they're real people and they have real feelings. And I think I think collectively we are becoming more aware of this and less unconscious about it. And I think that's a very good trend.
yeah.
I agree.
And the proof is in how we actually behave towards these people in all these circumstances.
What do you have
It's
in
not-
mind, Michael?
Well, when you're with someone and you appreciate deeply the work that they're doing, then the way in which I speak to them and I interact with them is different. And that's the proof. I don't have to say something, oh, I understand that it must be tough doing what you're doing. I went into a restaurant the other day to pick up some food, and I noticed that there were only 3 people there. Someone behind the drinks counter, someone bringing the food out, and someone sort of tidying the tables, but no patrons. And for whatever the reason, I felt very present while I was waiting for them to bring out my food. And I just said, business must be tough. And I don't know where that came from, but we then had a couple of minutes of interaction that was totally different from anything I might have expected, because I felt very present with those people. And that's the thing I think that I heard Judith describing, which is taking the time to be present physically while we're present for whatever the transaction happens to be.
Well, that is something that relates also to the difference between I it and I thou.
Mhm.
Being present in that way is exactly what is involved in an I thou relationship. And
Yeah.
what happens, as Buber describes it, and my own experience would undermine, is that it is very difficult, if not impossible, for us human beings to move easily between the two realms. If you're in the relational mode, the kinds of things that identify you to yourself, that cause there to be differences and barriers with the other person, are relegated to the background. And once you begin to think about the encounter, now you're now in the realm of I it. It's analytical. It's breaking things down into its parts. So we say that we're very proud of and thankful to our first responders and so forth, but that's not all they are either.
Mhm.
So we can appreciate them in that way, in a new sort of ways Judith is pointing out. Maybe not entirely new, but more popularly engaged in. And we might think that we have done something to encounter them as real people. But we've also, cut that short. We see them with this additional quality or this additional characteristic, and that's an improvement. But it's still not meeting with and engaging with the whole person.
Right, but it seems to me that, at least in my experience, the way it sort of worked is that you practice something
Yes.
that puts you in a position where it might arise.
Mm-hmm.
You can't draw a linear line from the practice that you do and the arising of this mode of interaction.
I think that's true. I would
And
agree.
yet you continue to do that.
Well, I think
And
the
so
problem,
that,
I'm sorry.
and I think that there's a kind of article of faith in continuing to do whatever the practice happens to be.
faith meaning what? What do you have in mind?
Faith that there will be better outcomes than worse outcomes by doing this particular practice.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And I'll tell you specifically, that not just from a philosophical point of view, but from an experiential point of view. In relationships that we have with our spouses or our children or all sorts of people, those relationships may not always be, in fact, they aren't usually, mostly on the level of I, thou.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But because we've had the experience of one time or another, the relationship being an I, thou relationship, we function in the belief that can happen again. It's possible. That might be the faith that way I would express the faith. You get married, and maybe day to day it's routine and it's the kids and it's work and so on and so forth, and maybe you're not interacting in the deepest and most elemental sort of way, and that can become a real problem.
Mm-hmm.
But if it is punctuated from time to time by an I thou moment, or at least you recall them and you think, well, that is still a possibility. That is still something that could happen in the future. Then all the rest of it is acceptable. It's you can deal with it, But once you begin to think that having the intimacy and the depth of an I thou relationship is not possible anymore, give up that hope or that possibility, then we're in a different ballgame. We are dealing with lawyers and courts and decrees and so on and so forth. I think that in the end, what the legend of the Pardes teaches us is that there is this possibility of something more meaningful behind what there appears to be. That we see the reflection, and the reflection is of ourselves, but the possibility that there is some other person, some other entity, some other experience to encounter is what makes that all possible to bear. When that possibility doesn't exist, or we become what's the word I'm looking for? Distanced or dislocated from it, that's where faith and hope and so forth begin to fall away.
Right.
And, depending on what kind of person you are, maybe you become depressed, or maybe you become sad, or maybe you become frustrated.
Or maybe you stop coming to the class.
Oh, no.
Oh, maybe so.
I know we're about ready to finish, and I want to add something that I am on the curriculum revision committee for Saging International right now because we have time to move on to curriculum. And my segment is relationships. And so I thank you doubly for this conversation.
Well, I'm glad it was helpful.
It's enriched what I'm about to finish writing. So thank you.
Well, that's terrific. And Michael, thank you for pointing out the reality that is the context for this discussion. I appreciate
Yes,
very much.
you're very welcome.
All right.
Okay,
So,
thank you all.